I'm Carol Ann, lifelong lover of the paranormal. And today we have more stories that might have you thinking twice about that camping trip you're thinking of out in the forest. Park Ranger John says that this next story is the only time in his career that he has ever questioned whether this job is the right one for him. This call was your typical lost child call. It was about a 4-year-old who had wandered away from her family's campsite and been missing for about 2 hours. And the parents were completely beside themselves, absolutely despondent. And they said the typical thing that parents do. It's not like her to wander off. She's so good at staying close. She's never done anything like this before. So they assure the parents they're going to find her, and they spread out in their standard search formation. Now, John is paired up with his good friend Carl. And as the two of them are hiking out, they're just holding conversation, which can sound kind of callous. But as John explains, A, this is kind of the norm for them, and B, you have to learn to desensitize a little bit in order to do this job. So they're out searching. They've been out for a good 2 hours, and they come out into this valley. They stop and look at each other, and there's this feeling almost like the depressurizing of a plane. And John said his ears even popped. And he had this feeling like he had just dropped 10 feet. And he starts to ask Carl if he felt that too. But before Carl can answer, they hear the loudest sound they've ever heard in their entire lives. It's like a freight train passing right next to them. But it's coming from everywhere. It's coming from all directions, even above and below them. Now Carl tries to scream something to John, but John can't hear anything other than this roar. And they're looking around to try to find the source of it, and neither one of them can see anything. So they're both totally freaked out. And John says that the only thing he could think of was a landslide. But if it were a landslide, it would have hit him by now. And the sound goes on, and they're standing right next to each other, trying to yell things at each other, but neither one of them can hear anything. And then just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Like somebody threw a switch and it was over. And they both stand there for a minute, perfectly still. And slowly, the normal forest sounds came back. Now, Carl asked John what the F just happened. And John doesn't have any idea, so he just kind of shrugs his shoulders. Then John gets on his radio and asks everybody else if they just heard the end of the world. And even though they're all within shouting distance of each other, nobody else heard anything. So John and Carl just kind of shrug it off and keep walking. Now, my question as a regular human being is, how do you go through that kind of experience and just shrug it off? But John says that when your job is to be out in the deep forest every day, that you can't really afford to get spooked. You just have to learn to shrug these things off and keep going to do your job. And for that, I tip my cap to those fearless search and rescue personnel. But back to the story. They go on for about another hour and they check on the radio, and nobody has found any trace of the young girl. And it's getting dark outside, and usually they don't search in the dark. But because they don't have any kind of a lead on her at all, John and Carl decide to keep going. And as they're searching on, they're staying close to one another, and they're calling out for the girl every couple of minutes. And John remembers thinking to himself that, oh God, they hope they can find her, because the woods can be scary enough to a kid in the daylight, but at night it's a whole nother nightmare. But they're not seeing any signs of her. They're not getting any responses. So about midnight, John and Carl decide to pack it up and head back to the rendezvous point. But about halfway back, Carl stops and shines his flashlight into a group of dead trees off to the right of them. And John asks, "Did you hear something?" And Carl says, "Shh, just listen." And they can both hear what sounds like a child crying. So they both call the girl's name, hoping to get some kind of a response. But all they can hear is this faint crying. So they start moving through the woods in that direction, kind of going around all of these dead trees, calling her name over and over again. And as they get closer, John says he starts getting this weird feeling in his gut. And he asks Carl, and Carl says he feels the same thing, but neither one of them can figure out what the problem is. So they stop where they are, and they call the girl's name again, and just then they figure out what the problem is. The crying sound that they're hearing is like somebody's playing a recording on a loop. It's the same kind of hiccup cry and then wail and then sobbing over and over again. Exactly the same every time. So without saying a word, they both take off running. And John says he's never ever lost his composure like that before. But they both knew something wasn't right, and they did not want to be out in those woods to find out what it is. And as for the little girl, they never found a trace of her. So Peter is out on recon one day looking for mountain lions. They had gotten several reports over the last few days that there was a mountain lion in the area. And one of their jobs when they get these kinds of reports is to kind of scout out the area and ensure that if there is a mountain lion in the area, they can close off the trails and kind of warn people to stay away. So he's out on the trail in a pretty forested area, and it's kind of getting close to dusk when he hears a woman scream. Now, some of you may know that when a mountain lion screams, it can sound like a woman being brutally murdered. Very unsettling, but not abnormal. So Peter radios back to headquarters to say that he'd heard this mountain lion scream, but he's going to keep going to see if he can figure out where its territory starts. And he heard it scream a couple more times from about the same area, so he could kind of determine where the mountain lion's territory was. So he starts heading back when he hears another scream, only this time it's only a few yards away from him. And at that point, he starts heading back to headquarters a little quicker because the last thing that he wants is to get mauled by a mountain lion out on this trail by himself. So as he gets back on the path heading toward headquarters, the screaming is following him. So he starts breaking into a jog. And as he gets to about a mile from headquarters, the screaming stops. So he turns around to see if the mountain lion is following him. It was almost night by this point, but he said he could see in the distance as the path rounded a corner what looked like the figure of a man standing there. So he calls out to them, warning this person that the paths are closed and that they need to head back to the welcome center. But the figure just stood there. So Peter started to walk over to him. And when he was about 10 yards away, the figure, as he puts it, took an impossibly long step straight toward him and let out the same scream that he had been hearing in the forest. Peter didn't say anything. He just turned around and sprinted back to headquarters, not stopping. By the time he got back to headquarters, the screaming had moved back into the woods. And Peter says he didn't tell anybody about what he saw. He just said, there's a mountain lion out in the woods, and we need to close the paths until it can be located and moved. Kathy tells the story of a family who is out in the woods berry picking. And this family, they have 2 young boys, both under the age of 5. And at one point during the day, one of the little boys goes missing. Now there is a massive search, but it turns up nothing. It's one of those cases like the kid has never been there. They bring in the dogs and the dogs just sit down because there's nothing for them to pick up on. And no trace of the kid is ever found. The search goes on for about 2 months and then is eventually called off. Fast forward 6 months, the family comes back to the forest to lay flowers on a memorial site that had been constructed for the little boy. And of course, they bring their other son. And while the parents were laying those flowers on the memorial, they lose sight of that second son for about 3 seconds. And in that span of time, the second son vanishes into thin air. Now, obviously, the parents are devastated. It's hard enough to imagine losing one child, but then losing a second child is completely unimaginable. The search for the second child is huge, the largest in state history. There are like 300 volunteers combing every inch of the area looking for this little boy. But again, no trace of him. And the search goes on for about a week, with people looking miles away from the park area that he disappeared from. And then about 2 weeks later, a volunteer about 15 miles away from the initial search area radios in that she has found the little boy. Now, everyone had assumed that the little boy was dead by this time, but she radioed in that not only is he alive, but he's in really good shape. So Kathy and her team go out to recover the little boy. And when they get there, she can't believe this is the kid that's been missing. His clothes are clean. There's no dirt on him anywhere. And the kid doesn't appear to be traumatized in any way. The volunteer says that she found the kid sitting on a log, playing with a stick bundle that was tied together with an old rope. So Katie asked the little boy where he's been for the last 2 weeks. Who has he been with? And the kid tells her he's been with the fuzzy man. Now, Kathy firmly believes in Bigfoot, so she gets all excited and asks him what he means by fuzzy. Was he hairy? But the kid says no, he wasn't hairy, he was fuzzy. And the kid goes on to describe that the man was blurry, like when you close your eyes but not all the way closed. He says the fuzzy man came out of the trees and took him back into the deep woods. The kid says he slept in a hollow tree and the fuzzy man gave him berries to eat when he was hungry. So Kathy asks him if the fuzzy man was mean. Did he scare him? And the little boy says, no, he wasn't scary, but I didn't like how he didn't have eyes. Kathy says they take the kid back to headquarters and a cop takes him into town to ask him a little bit more about his ordeal. Now later on, Kathy would find out that the cop who talked to him said that the little boy described being kept in this tree and that the fuzzy man would give him berries to eat when he was hungry. He was allowed to wander in a very specific clearing, but when he went outside of that clearing, the fuzzy man would get really mad and yell really loud, even though he didn't have a mouth. And when the little boy got scared at night, the fuzzy man made it go brighter and gave him the little stick bundle. He said the fuzzy man was going to keep him, but he had to let him go because he wasn't the right kind. And the little boy either can't or won't elaborate on that. The cops are kind of left scratching their heads, and the search for his brother is then renewed, but with no results. The kid has no idea where his brother might be, and they never find him. Jane recalls a story about an older gentleman who went out hiking on a very well-established trail. But his wife called the ranger station to let them know that her husband hadn't come home when he was supposed to. Apparently, this gentleman had a history of seizures, and his wife was afraid that maybe he'd forgotten his medication and had a seizure out on the trail. Now, Jane says in this kind of a situation, she doesn't ask why he would think it's a good idea to go out hiking by himself when he has this kind of medical condition. Because at some point, it just doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's her job to go find them. So they go out in standard search formation, and it doesn't take long before the lead searcher finds evidence of where he has gone off the trail. So all of the searchers group up around him where they found that they'd gone off the trail, and they start fanning out from that point to try to find him. So they're all out there looking when suddenly a call comes over the radio that everybody needs to head back to the lead searcher's location. So they all hurry up, because usually when a call like that happens, it means that the person has been found, but he's injured. So they need the whole team to be able to get that person out safely. Once they all make it back to that lead searcher's location, they see that he's just standing at the base of this tree looking up. So Jane asks her partner what's going on, and her partner just points up in the tree. And up in the tree, 30 feet off the ground, is a walking stick. And the loop on the end of the walking stick is looped around one of the branches, and it's just hanging there. She has no idea how it could even get up there. There's no way a person could have thrown it up that far. And they look around and there's no signs of that person still being in the area. And a few of them even start calling his name up into the tree, even though everyone could see into the tree and see that no one was in the tree. They were all just left scratching their heads. And the search continued, but they never found a trace of that missing gentleman. Now, eventually, the search was called off because other calls come in and they have to attend to those instead. But the man's wife called the ranger station every day for months, asking if they had found her husband. And Jane says it was just heartbreaking to hear the wife's voice get a little more hopeless every time. And she doesn't know why exactly this story is sticking with her, except maybe the improbability and the weirdness of it all. That, and maybe just the questions that it left unanswered. How did the cane get up in the tree? Did somebody kill the guy and crawl up the tree and hang it there as like a trophy? Jane says that the memory of that cane hanging there just felt like something taunts her to this day. Gary tells the story of a little boy who vanished from a picnic area late fall one year. Now, in addition to this little boy having a mental disability, he also had a physical disability. And his parents just kept saying over and over again that he could not have wandered off by himself. It was impossible for him to have wandered off by himself. Somebody had to have taken him. Now, Gary says they searched for that little boy for weeks, going miles outside of the area that they thought he could be. But it was like he was never there. Even the dogs couldn't pick up a scent, not even in the picnic area where he'd been with his family. And suspicion fell on the parents, but they were totally devastated. So it became pretty clear quickly that they had nothing to do with this. The search was concluded about a month later with no traces of the boy having been found. Now, fast forward to late winter. Everyone had pretty much forgotten about this particular case, and Gary was on a training operation on one of the higher elevations in the mountain range that their park surrounded, when he saw something in the snow. And he saw it from pretty far away, but as he got closer, he realized it was a shirt sticking out of the snow. And because of the distinctive pattern on the shirt, he immediately recognized it as the shirt that the little boy from back in the fall was supposedly wearing. So Gary starts looking around, and about 20 yards away, he finds the body of the little boy. But he says there's no way that this kid has been dead for very long, even though he'd been missing for 3 months. And the little boy was curled up around something. And when Gary kind of brushed the snow off to see what it was, he couldn't believe it. The kid was holding on to a big chunk of ice that had kind of been carved into something that kind of looked like a human. And the kid was holding it so tight that it had frostbitten his hands and his chest. Gary radioed the rest of his crew, and a recovery team was brought up to bring the boy off the mountain. Now, Gary says when he thinks back on this case, he just doesn't understand. How can a physically handicapped child disappear for 3 months and show up 50 miles away at the top of a mountain? Not to mention the fact that there was no food, not even water found in the boy's system. He said it's like something just snatched him from the face of the earth, held him in suspended animation for 3 months, and then dropped him back down in the snow to die of exposure. Now, this next story is from a park ranger named Molly, and it happened to her, but it happened to her when she was a little girl. She says when she was a kid, her and her friend Lucy used to go out into the woods behind her house a lot. Molly lived in northern Maine, where there is a lot of dense, unpopulated national forest. She says the woods up there are so thick that it basically blots out almost all of the sunlight. But she and Lucy had grown up there, so they were kind of used to that. But they always did maintain a little bit of caution in certain areas. She said it was never really talked about, but it was an unwritten rule never to go more than 1 or 2 miles into that forest. The adults never said why, but nobody ever ventured out that far. She and Lucy used to make up stories about bears being as big as houses, and they used to scare each other by hiding and making growling noises while the other one would look for them. Now, Molly says one summer, a big storm came through and blew down lots of trees and started a fire in the forest a few miles from her house. Now, fire crews got it under control, but she said that some of those firemen came back not quite the same. It was like they'd been to war. And you could tell the ones who got really scared because they all had kind of the same look on their face, kind of that shell-shocked look. Lucy said they looked like walking dead people. They didn't smile or say anything when you went up to them. And most of them left town once everything was over. Now, Molly asked her parents about it, but her parents said that they didn't know anything about it. Now, once the okay was given that the woods were safe again, Molly and Lucy decided to hike out to see where the fire had been. So they hike out, and in about 2 miles or so, they start seeing burnt trees and stuff. Molly says she can remember Lucy getting really upset when they found a deer skeleton curled up at the base of a tree, and that she had to practically drag Lucy away from it because Lucy wanted to bury it. But Molly says there was something about it that just wasn't right. There was something wrong with the antlers. She doesn't remember exactly what was wrong. She just remembers that she didn't want Lucy to touch it, that neither one of them should be touching this thing. So they keep walking. And the further they go, the more burnt everything got. Eventually, there were no standing trees. And she said it was like being on another planet. Almost nothing green, just brown and black everywhere. And they're just standing there, kind of taking it all in, when they hear somebody shouting in the distance. So Molly panics, thinking it's her dad and he's going to come and tell her that she's grounded. And Lucy takes off and goes and hides behind a big rock because she says she doesn't want to get caught out here. Her parents had forbidden her to come out here at all, and she had lied to them and said that they were going to a movie. So Molly follows her behind the rock, and they just keep listening. She could hear this voice getting closer and closer, and she realized they're calling for help. And she thought maybe it was just some hiker who got lost and needed directions back to town. That used to happen all the time, so she was used to helping those people out. So she starts calling out to him. And when she figures out that he's following her voice, she keeps calling to him until she sees him running at her in the distance. And as he gets closer, Molly can see that his face is all red. So Molly tells Lucy to give her backpack because she knows that Lucy has a first aid kit. And Lucy makes this noise like she's grossed out and asks Molly if she saw his face. Molly just tells Lucy to shut up, and she starts jogging toward the strange man. So Molly and the strange man meet about halfway. And when they stopped, Molly could see that his nose, his lips, and part of his forehead were all gone. It was like they'd been sliced clean off, and he was bleeding pretty bad. So she takes a step back just because she's kind of afraid to move when he grabs her shoulders. And Molly felt like she got a shock. And the guy jumps back and just kind of starts babbling. And the only thing that Molly can understand is that he kept asking how long he'd been gone. And he asked where his unit was. But Molly just shook her head. And he looked over and saw Molly's Walkman and started screaming. And he just kept babbling and touching his face. And that's when Molly saw that he wasn't wearing the right clothing. He had on some kind of weird gray cloth jacket and like these almost formal pants. And on the jacket were these weird buttons, and it had red trim around it. And he's continuing to babble, but Molly's just shaking her head and telling him she doesn't understand what he's saying. And then she turns to her first aid kit, but he just starts screaming again and screams the only thing that she really did understand.
Don't touch me. You'll make me go back there.
And after that, he ran off, and Molly could hear him screaming all the way until she couldn't hear him anymore. So she turns around and looks at Lucy, and Lucy's just crying. So the two girls just packed up their stuff and started walking back to town. And Lucy asked Molly over and over again, what happened? Who was that guy? But Molly didn't say a word. And when they got home, Molly told Lucy she didn't want to go with her into those woods anymore. They stayed friends, but they never talked about that guy ever again. If you liked this video, go ahead and click right here on a video that YouTube has picked out just for you. See you next time on the In-Between.